the future, and that was rightly the focus of this Council. So first, we agreed important measures needed to restore Europe's competitiveness. Next, we discussed the separate intergovernmental treaty on fiscal discipline in the Eurozone. And finally, we issued a statement on Iran, Syria and Burma. And I'm going to take each in turn. Mr. Speaker, Britain's agenda in Europe is to promote growth, competitiveness and jobs. We've repeatedly said that the best way that the EU can drive growth and create jobs is to complete the single market, to establish trade deals with the fastest growing parts of the world, and to cut the regulatory burdens on business. At this Council, we made important progress on all of these issues. We agreed to establish a fully functioning single market in services, where there are still 4,700 professions across Europe to which access is regulated by government, and in digital, where there are over a dozen separate copyright regimes in what should be one single market. We'll take action to secure what should be a fast-growing area right across Europe. Together, these changes alone on services and digital could add more than 6% to EU GDP within a decade. We also agreed to complete the energy single market, which has the potential to cut costs for businesses and consumers across Europe. On free trade, we said that 2012 should be a decisive year to move ahead on trade agreements with major partners such as Japan, India, Canada, and the United States. And on regulation, we agreed to a growth test for the first time to ensure, and I quote, that all actions at the European Union level fully support growth and job creation. We also agreed to reduce regulatory burdens, especially for SMEs and micro enterprises, and we agreed to complete a patent package to support innovation. This has been discussed in Europe for well over a decade, and finally we are making decisive progress. Next, the Eurozone. Mr. Speaker, we want the Eurozone to sort out its problems. They are having a chilling effect on our own economy, and tackling them is one of the best ways in which we can help secure growth, both here in Britain and right across Europe. As I've repeatedly said, short-term steps must be taken and taken properly. The so-called October package. Europe's banks must be recapitalised properly. The uncertainty in Greece must be brought to a decisive end. And the firewall that needs to be constructed must be big enough to deal with the full scale of the crisis and the potential contagion. In the longer term, proper fiscal discipline in the Eurozone is clearly an important part of the solution, and it's something Britain recognises is necessary. So the question has never been about whether there should be greater fiscal discipline in the Eurozone, but rather how it should be achieved. I went to the European Council last December prepared to agree a treaty of all 27 countries, but only if there were proper safeguards for Britain. I did not get those safeguards, so I vetoed that treaty. As a result, Eurozone countries and others are now making separate arrangements outside the EU treaties for strengthening budgetary discipline, including ensuring there are much tougher rules on deficits. So at this Council, 25 EU member states agreed a new treaty outside the European Union. Britain and the Czech Republic have not signed up, and we will not be taking part. Now let me deal directly with the issue of the institutions. The new agreement sets out roles for the European Commission and the European Court of Justice. While some of those roles are already permitted through existing treaties, there are legal questions about what is planned. Now, as I've said, it is in Britain's interest that the Eurozone sorts out its problems. And it's also in our interest that the new agreement outside the EU is restricted to issues of fiscal union and does not encroach on the single market. And the new intergovernmental agreement is absolutely explicit and clear that it cannot encroach on the competences of the European Union, and they must not take measures that in any way undermine the EU single market. But nevertheless, I made clear we will watch this closely, and if necessary, we will take action, including legal action, if our national interests are threatened by the misuse of the institutions.
Order. There's a fine line between jollity and hysteria, and I fear that the honourable member for Rhondda is in danger of having crossed it. He must calm himself by whatever means are necessary. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The principle that the EU institutions should only act with the explicit authorisation of all member states remains. So, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. This is a treaty outside the EU. We are not signing it, we are not ratifying it, we are not part of it, and it places no obligations on the United Kingdom. It does not have the force of EU law for us, nor does it have the force of EU law for the EU institutions, nor does it have the force of EU law for the countries who signed it. And there will be no inner group of European countries distorting the single market from inside the EU treaty. That is the fundamental protection we secured with our veto in December, and that protection remains. Mr. Speaker, we also made an important statement on development in Burma and Syria. Britain has played a leading role in getting Europe to act together on each of these issues. On Iran, last week, all EU countries agreed an unprecedented oil embargo, which shows our determination to keep up the pressure on the regime to turn away from any plans to develop nuclear weapons. In Burma, for years, Aung San Suu Kyi has been an inspiration to her people and to the world. Britain has supported her at every stage and has been at the forefront of EU sanctions. Now there are signs of a new moment of opportunity for democracy, and we should be prepared to relax these sanctions, but only in stages and only in response to reforms. When I spoke to Aung San Suu Kyi on Saturday, she emphasised the importance of credible and free by-elections in April. I can assure the House we'll be watching this very closely. On Syria, the Council condemned the continuing violence and the repression of the Syrian people. Mr. Speaker, reports suggest that more than 60 people were killed on the streets of Syria last week alone. In total, more than 5,000 people have been killed, 400 children murdered, tens of thousands of people detained. Today, the Foreign Secretary is in New York to support the Arab League's call for the Security Council action condemning repression and supporting a transition of power. All 27 EU member states backed that call for UN action, and if the violence doesn't end, we agreed we will tighten EU sanctions further. Our message is clear. We will stand with the Syrian people. It is time for all members of the UN Security Council to live up to their responsibilities instead of shielding those who have blood on their hands. The killing must stop, and President Assad must stand aside. Mr. Speaker, this was an important council for Britain. On competitiveness, the single market and trade, Britain is setting the agenda. On action to face down dictators and dangerous regimes in Iran and Syria, Britain is leading the way. And by saying no to a new EU treaty, we have protected Britain's interests, and I commend this statement to the House.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and can I associate myself with his remarks about Iran, Syria and indeed Burma? On these issues, there has been a bipartisan approach, and the government has our full support in the effort it is making. Mr. Speaker, having heard the Prime Minister's statement on Europe, the whole House now knows the truth, that with this Prime Minister, a veto is not for life, it's just for Christmas. He said, calm down, dear, calm down. He said it was a real veto on the use of European institutions, and his backbenchers believed him. Mr. Speaker, even his cabinet believed him. What did the Welfare Secretary, where is he? What did the Welfare Secretary say just this weekend? He could not have been clearer, and I quote, "The fact is, the Prime Minister vetoed them using the institutions." There was not a glimmer of doubt in his mind. He was asked if the structures of the EU would be used for the fiscal compact, and he said this: "The Prime Minister has already made clear he vetoed any such possibility of that happening." Now, it's no wonder the Welfare Secretary said it, Mr. Speaker, because it's what the Chancellor said the day after the summit. This is what he said on the Saturday morning. "If we had signed the treaty, we would have found the full force of the European Court, the European Commission, all of those institutions enforcing those treaties, using that opportunity to undermine Britain's interests. We were not prepared to let that happen." So, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister now confirm that the treaty will be ruled on by the European Court of Justice? Will he confirm that? Article 8 of the treaty says yes. Will he confirm it? Can he tell us whether the European Commission will implement this treaty? Article 8 says yes. Yep. And what about the Prime Minister's line in the sand? Because, Mr. Speaker, we know that at 4 a.m. on that fateful Friday morning, he laid down the law to his fellow European leaders and said, you won't be able to use the buildings. So can he now tell us whether the buildings of the European institutions will be used? Apparently, Mr. Speaker, the answer to that one is yes as well. So on the European Court, on the Commission, on the buildings, the phantom veto of December is now exposed. But, Mr. Speaker, what does the Prime Minister cling to? What did he say at the press conference yesterday? He said this. He said, there isn't an EU treaty. Because I vetoed it, it doesn't exist. So, Mr. Speaker, this agreement involves the European Court of Justice, the European Commission, the European buildings, 25 out of 27 countries, and he says it's not really a treaty.
Oh, there we are then.
Mr. Speaker, sorry? Here is it. Here's the treaty. Here's the treaty. Mr. Speaker, it talks like a European treaty. It walks like a European treaty. It is a European treaty. And for Britain, he has secured absolutely no protections at all. He says he has secured protections about discussion on the single market. But the treaty says the contracting parties shall take actions in the following areas: fostering competitiveness, promoting employment, reinforcing financial stability. Mr. Speaker, it certainly sounds like the single market to me. Can he confirm the United Kingdom will not even have observer status at the regular meetings of the 25 to find out what is going on and whether the single market is being discussed? So he needs to answer the question. Who is, and I think his backbenchers will be interested in this, who is going to protect the British national interest at these meetings? It's all right, Mr. Speaker.
Who's it going to be?
It's all right, Mr. Speaker.
Who's it going to be?
It's all right, Mr.
Not
Speaker,
David or George.
because Britain won't be represented.
We're not there.
Britain won't be represented at these meetings, but the Prime Minister has a last line of defence: the European Commission. Mr. Speaker, you could not make it up, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister reduced to relying on the people he calls the bureaucrats from Brussels to represent him at the meeting. In the topsy-turvy world of this Prime Minister, that is all he has left: his thin blue line against the 25 countries exceeding their mandate. Mr. Speaker, instead of ending up in this position, the Prime Minister should not have walked out of the meeting in December. No, he shouldn't.
Order. I apologise for interrupting the Leader of the Opposition. I exhorted some calm on the opposition benches. I now do so on the government benches, and I say to the honourable gentleman, the member for Shrewsbury and Atcham, in the nicest and kindest and most public-spirited possible way, if he does insist on gesticulating, which he shouldn't, it's pretty silly to do it when he's standing right next to me. The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, instead of constructing phantom vetoes, he should have been getting a solution to the problems of the Eurozone, our largest export market. But of course he can't do that. He is committed to failing austerity at home, so he can't oppose collective austerity abroad. And there are growing fears, Mr. Speaker, that the scale of austerity required under this treaty will not work. So can the Prime Minister tell us whether the economic strategy in the fiscal compact will work? And if he doesn't believe it will work, why isn't he arguing for change? Mr. Speaker, this summit has been bad for Britain. There is still no solution to the problems of growth in Europe. In the cold light of day, the Prime Minister's veto that never was has been exposed. He made a grand promise which turned out to be worthless. No wonder even his backbenchers say they can't believe a word he says. Britain's The reality is this: Britain stands with less influence than we have for a generation. It's bad for business, it's bad for jobs, it's bad for families.